Absolute chaos broke out in Nepal on September 9th, 2025. Internet users on Discord overthrew the government, burned hundreds of buildings including the parliament, and even voted in this poll to choose a new prime minister. These Gen Z protests got so intense that ministers had to escape by desperately hanging onto this rope tied to a helicopter, and another official was beaten with shoes as he ran away from protesters on the streets. The question is, though, why did this entire revolution happen in the first place? Traditional news outlets say it happened because Nepal banned social media platforms, but that's not really true, and in reality there are many other reasons why this uprising took place. In this video, we'll be showing everything the media is hiding and investigating footage that explains how a Discord server managed to overthrow an entire government. On September 8th, 2025, thousands of people gathered in the capital city of Kathmandu for a peaceful protest. Most of them were Gen Z between the ages of 20 and 25, and they marched starting from a symbolic monument towards the massive parliament building. Police were quickly deployed, and they used rubber bullets, water cannons, and tear gas to repel the protesters. As the day went on, though, the people were able to push forward, and they made it all the way to the gates where more police were standing guard. At this point, there were no serious injuries on either side of the incident, but sadly, it would not stay that way for long. The government gave the order to begin shooting into the crowd with live ammunition. These were peaceful, unarmed protesters facing fully armed police units, so as you might imagine, they didn't stand a chance. By the end of that day, 19 people were dead and 400 were injured.
So they were just protesting, but like government started violence, they started shooting the children in the school dress. It shouldn't be done.
Gut-wrenching photos of children in their school uniforms began circulating on Discord, Reddit, and other social media, angering millions and igniting one of the most insane revolutions in recent history. A viral post read, "My government is shooting students, and international news is glossing over everything." People were outraged by the abundance of misleading news, but the truth did get out, and everyone in Nepal prepared for action the following day. Millions of people took to the streets the next morning, and they were not so peaceful this time around. After seeing the carnage from the day before, everyone was taking this seriously, and they had a newfound level of hatred for their government. The protests were also no longer limited to the capital, and people all across the country were pouring out into the streets. They smashed cars, threw rocks at police, and used fuel to start massive fires. It felt like the entire country was ablaze, literally and metaphorically. This type of protest can often devolve into a senseless riot, but that would actually not be the case in Nepal. Everyone was clearly targeting the government, and they were careful to spare most of the small businesses as they marched towards their targets. You could probably look to the left and see a government facility being engulfed in flames, and then look to the right and see a local tea shop completely unharmed. This level of coordination was only possible because this whole thing was being organized in real time on Discord. Everyone was joining a server called Youths Against Corruption, and it would go on to play a major role in this revolution. As you can see in these photos, protesters were marching around with QR codes that invited everyone to join the server, making it quickly surpass 100,000 members. By midday, the protests were getting intense and had already inflicted billions in damages, but surprisingly, this was just the start. Things would go on to escalate quite a bit further. All of this would happen, and the government would eventually be overthrown. But let's back up for a second, because context is really important here. A lot of news outlets, especially those from India, reported misinformation. So we have to go back in time to uncover the truth and the real reasons why this happened. Originally, this movement got started all because Nepal gained access to the internet. In 2011, only 9% of the population was online, but fast forward a decade later and almost everyone had a reliable connection. People would previously rely on government-sponsored radio and TV, so when the internet came along, people finally began to see the truth about their shady politicians. The positions of power had basically just been rotating between the same group of old guys for a very long time, and all of them were facing corruption allegations. It was allegedly common for the politicians to sell government land to private individuals just to profit from it and line their own pockets. One minister was accused of making illegal commissions by selling expensive aircraft, and his wife was accused of making fake refugee documents so that citizens could resettle in the United States. Frustratingly, all of this corruption was never formally investigated or resolved because these politicians had near immunity against investigation. By labeling their actions as policy decisions, their cases were treated as off-limits and nobody actually pressed any charges. This obviously angered the people even more, and resentment continued to grow as these corruption stories became popular on social media. By 2020, a survey found that 84% of Nepalis believed that government corruption is a big problem, and unfortunately, it didn't seem like things were going to get much better. Since the power just kept rotating between a small number of politicians, it felt like progress was impossible. These 3 aging prime ministers were repeatedly appointed over and over, and Deuba somehow managed to serve 5 separate times despite numerous allegations. This was an issue because many of these politicians were thought to only care about enriching themselves and the other political elites, while leaving the country poor, misgoverned, and unemployed. Frustration grew rapidly over the next few years, and Gen Z started trends such as the Nepo Babies and Nepo Kids hashtags. These trends highlighted the lavish lifestyle of politicians' kids, who would often flex their expensive cars, mansions, and trips abroad. It really showed how there was such a striking contrast between the rich elite and everyone else being in poverty and struggling with unemployment. For example, in 2024, the youth employment rate in Nepal was an incredibly high 20.8%. That means that 1 in 5 people couldn't find a job, and many of them were forced to move abroad and relocate their careers elsewhere. In fact, 33% of the country's entire GDP is now from people who work abroad and then send their money back to their families in Nepal. This situation here became so bad that 15,000 Nepalis signed up to fight for Russia in the Ukraine war. This became even more insane when they got deployed to the front lines after just 2 weeks of training, and a lot of them unfortunately did not survive. This really puts the state of the job market into perspective. It was so awful that 15,000 men signed up to fight in someone else's war and potentially die just to earn $2,000 a month. It was clear that everyone in the youth population was furious about the financial disparity and overall inequality, and this sentiment could be pretty much summed up by this poster, which read, "Politicians' children return from abroad with Gucci bags. Our children return in coffins." By 2023, the unrest had gained a lot of momentum, and the social media trends were going viral. As you might expect, the corrupt politicians didn't like this, so they decided to find a way to stop it. In order to do this, they created a directive that basically required every single social media platform to establish a local presence in Nepal. They said that this was to help cut down on misinformation, but in reality, many people believed that politicians were just trying to silence the Nepo Kids trend and all of the other negative content. The Ministry of Communications and Technology also said that it would ban any social media platform that did not comply with their demand by August 2025. Fast forward to that date, and guess what? Pretty much nobody registered with Nepal's government or established a local presence. The big social media platforms didn't really seem to care, and they also didn't want to engage with censorship at the hands of potentially corrupt politicians. Because none of them responded to Nepal's demand, the Supreme Court upheld a law that banned every single social media platform except for TikTok, which was the only big name that actually registered. And thus, on September 4th, 2025, they initiated the blackout, and everything went offline. The social media ban was very unpopular among Nepal's youth for very obvious reasons, but it also hit extra hard because so many citizens had moved abroad. Social media was the only way that many of these people could communicate with their loved ones in other countries. It felt like the government had failed to address the awful state of the job market, forced people to leave the country, and then deliberately cut off any way to talk to those people by banning WhatsApp and basically everything else. Many people claimed that this was also giving the government absolute control over online content, and it was basically equivalent to having them own every source of information. With all of this in mind, though, it is important to note that people were still able to use social media despite the ban by using VPNs. This was largely how they managed to communicate and come up with tactics for the protest. Another contributing factor for the protests that was severely underreported was when the government ran over an 11-year-old girl and then seemed to not care. On the morning of September 6th, 2025, a black SUV carrying a provincial minister ran over this 11-year-old schoolgirl who was using a crosswalk in the city of Lalitpur. Instead of stopping, this vehicle sped away, just leaving her there in the street. When questioned about the incident, the Prime Minister somehow just shrugged it off, claiming it was a quote, normal accident. This response and the footage of the vehicle went viral, and it represented yet another reason to be outraged by the establishment. Based on what we've covered in the past few minutes, you can probably see how Gen Z was pushed to a breaking point by the insane levels of unemployment, the social media ban, nepotism, and countless other examples of allegedly corrupt politicians abusing their power. Although Gen Z kind of has a reputation for never being able to do anything, they seem to have a bit of power in Nepal because the population is really young and about 56% of the citizens are under the age of 30. That means that this entire generation grew up resenting their government, and then when they banned social media and started shooting, this is what happened. September 9th, 2025 is when the protests really reached their peak. The social media ban was lifted after the first day, and Discord users quickly announced that a mass of people were headed to the Prime Minister's house. Just hours later, his house was burned to the ground, and it didn't stop there. They targeted basically every single major politician's residence, burning hundreds of buildings in total, and demolishing every government vehicle they came across. As mentioned earlier, ministers had to use extreme measures to escape the burning buildings, including dangling their entire family on a rope attached to a military helicopter. It seems that somehow they actually managed to survive that ordeal. An angry mob had previously surrounded their house, making the helicopter perhaps the only way to get out. All over the streets, all over the country, it was absolute insanity. Nobody expected this many people to turn out, and nobody expected this level of coordination. The Discord server helped communicate vital information about medical supplies, protest routes, and even tutorials on how to set stuff on fire. Burn their mansions became a trend that day, instantly spreading across the country. Certain memes even became primary methods of spreading information, probably confusing older generations. The one-piece pirate flag became the primary symbol of the revolution, much like it had recently in Indonesia and France. It was later hung on the gates of the central government palace, resulting in this incredibly powerful image. In what you might call typical Gen Z fashion, people began recording TikToks in the streets, playing Uno, and dancing in front of buildings that they had just set on fire. The most notable buildings that were lost include the Ministerial Palace, the Parliament, the Supreme Court, the President's Office, and the houses of almost every other top political figure. A good portion of the non-government properties were spared, but protesters did destroy a Hilton hotel because it was closely associated with the government. Clouds of smoke and tear gas filled the air that entire day, to the point where they had to close Nepal's biggest airport because they literally couldn't see through the haze. Discord users also decided to fly drones and set off fireworks in the area, ensuring that planes were grounded and politicians could not escape. However, this also had the unintentional result of trapping random people in the country, including this tourist named Harry. He had a small YouTube channel, so he decided to start vlogging the protests, and he unintentionally captured some of the most incredible 4K footage, as you can see here.
It's on fire in front of me, sorry. People are celebrating, smashing everything. You can see Parliament has been destroyed.
When he posted the footage, he became famous overnight in Nepal, and he gained 700,000 subscribers on his channel, which I highly recommend checking out. It's insane how he accidentally became one of the most important journalists in the country's history and managed to document an entire revolution entirely by accident. Given that most of the protesters were Gen Z though, there were also plenty of other amazing photos and videos like these ones, showing the true scale and intensity of the moment. One Twitter user called this the hardest picture of 2025, as a group of protesters gathered in front of the burning parliament to take selfies. As if they were sending a warning to other governments, many of them stated that this can serve as an example of what happens when issues like corruption and unemployment are ignored. Later that day, less than 48 hours after the initial protests began, Prime Minister Oli resigned. In view of the adverse situation in the country, I have resigned effective today to facilitate the solution to the problem and help resolve it politically in accordance with the Constitution. Victorious protesters ran through the parliament halls in celebration, and people could be heard shouting about the news even above all the chaos going on in the cities. Hundreds of people started dancing around fires and chanting anti-corruption slogans, while others sprayed graffiti and held up posters. One of them read, "Okay, Boomer, time's up." Somehow, some way, these Gen Z protesters had actually managed to do it. They had overthrown their government in the world's first internet-native revolution, and they did it in under 48 hours. With the government now in complete ruins though, the question that came to everyone's mind is, what do we actually want to do next? The Discord's primary focus at this point was choosing a new prime minister. Following the resignation of Sharma Oli, thousands of people began to debate in the server about who should take his place. For a brief moment, this server basically became the government of Nepal, and the Discord mods felt like the most powerful people in the country. There were tons of channels dedicated to the prime minister debate, and thousands of users gathered in the voice channels to discuss their favorite candidates. Somewhat notably, this also allowed citizens who were living abroad to voice their opinions, even though they weren't physically out in the streets with everybody else. As you might expect, there were plenty of gamers and users with anime profile pictures, but by this point the server had also grown well beyond the typical Discord crowd. It felt like everyone was getting involved, and in just a matter of hours, they would go on to decide the future of the entire country. They were about to create a Discord poll that would effectively determine the next prime minister. While all of this was going on though, the army eventually took control of the streets and shut down basically everything in every major city. Harry's vlog highlights how calm the streets became when just a short time ago they were full of riots and smoke. He was glad to find that his motorbike was completely untouched, while nearby police vehicles got absolutely destroyed by the crowds. There was also a surprisingly fast and strong movement by civilians to clean up the wreckage, led by none other than Gen Z. The exact people who burned down half the city were now sweeping, rebuilding, and trying to repair wherever possible. These efforts were certainly a positive gesture and a positive impact, but sadly, these weren't going to really undo the damage that had already been done. The death toll had reached a staggering number of 72, making this Nepal's deadliest outbreak of political violence in the past several decades. Families held vigils to commemorate their loved ones who did not survive the conflict. At least 2,113 people were injured, and the property damage was very extensive. Some estimates put the damage as high as $22.5 billion or about 3 trillion Nepalese rupees. To put that into perspective, that number is literally half of the country's entire GDP. It also demonstrates, in somewhat of a twisted way, how so much of the wealth was concentrated among the political elites, leaving very little for the average person. Another consequence is that crime could also become a major issue, since 12,500 prisoners escaped during the protest and remained at large. On September 10th, 2025, the Discord mods started the poll that would select the prime minister. Out of the 5 candidates, Sushila Karki took the lead, eventually securing the majority of the votes. While these votes didn't technically have any legal power, they did create a clear public consensus that the people wanted Karki, and in the absence of the government, this consensus proved to be powerful. It also gained even more validity as it was plastered all over global news headlines. The true influence of the Discord poll really became evident though when Karki met with the army chief in control of the country, and soon after, she was sworn in as the first ever female prime minister of Nepal on September 12th, 2025. The timeline was remarkable because in just under 48 hours, Gen Z had physically overthrown the government, forced the old prime minister to resign, and then 2 days later they had already sworn a new leader into office. Karki was the overwhelmingly popular choice for her strong anti-corruption agenda, but apparently, she didn't really want the position. She reluctantly accepted it though due to popular demand, saying, "I'm not here because of my personal wish. Those young boys and girls, they asked me, they requested me." Interestingly, much of the traditional media didn't seem to properly recognize or understand what really happened and what made it so unique. They didn't really get how memes or social media largely caused this revolution and made it successful. The resentment was built online, the protests were planned on Discord, and the Prime Minister was functionally chosen there too. At the end of the day, saying that this was a protest about a social media ban is simply a misguided opinion at best. Because the Nepali constitution doesn't exactly have rules about what happens after you elect a new prime minister on Discord, Karki is serving a transitional term. She announced that she will relinquish power to a new government after 6 months when elections are held. No matter who is leading the country though, Nepal has a lot of rebuilding to do. Important landmarks and structures are gone forever, many lives were lost, and it will take years to fully recover. But the hope is that they will be able to do so successfully under better governance. These 5 men were sucked into a narrow undersea oil pipeline and trapped in there for days. They used a GoPro to record some of the most disturbing footage I've ever seen, and you can watch that video here. Go ahead and click on that now, and thanks for watching.